Just by way of introduction, our industry comprises approximately 1,400 individual businesses, about 700 grape growers and 700 winemakers. They're all highly individual, they are all highly passionate, and if you get 10 winemakers or grape growers in a room, you've got at least 11 different opinions, I can assure you. So what I'd just like to do today is talk a little bit about where the industry's at, the progress that's made over the last 20 odd years, and then how we've actually achieved that progress. So here we go. This slide I like, I've got to say, this is why it's here. This is the average value of wine traded around the world, so the dollar value per litre of wine traded around the world. And you can see on your extreme left, the country with the highest average price is France at around $6.59 a litre. So we all know that averages hide a myriad stories, but $6.59. France has been at the wine business for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Who's second on that graph? It's little old New Zealand. The first grapes were planted in New Zealand in 200 years ago, 1819, but the modern New Zealand wine industry can be dated from the 1980s, so it's 30 years old. And you can see that we are a quantum ahead of the third ranked country in terms of the average price, which is the United States. Our dear neighbours Australia, our colleagues, you can see are somewhere more towards the right end of the scale at $2.26. We've achieved that second place in a 30-year period, and it's pretty stunning. And a whole lot of other countries around the world look at that and think, wouldn't we love to be New Zealand? Particularly Ukraine and Moldova on the right end of the scale, where they can't get even $1 a litre. And in fact, if I go on into the international wine market and I want to buy wine, I can buy it at 50 cents a litre. It's sort of the standard price for cheap, undifferentiated product. So that's where we've got to. That's our export story over the last 30 years. So in the 1980s, we exported virtually nothing. And in 1992, we were exporting about $25 million of wine per annum. We said by 2000 we would export $100 million, so a fourfold increase. A lot of people thought we were nuts, didn't believe it could happen. We got to 120 million. When we got to that level, we said we would do about $500 million by 2005. We got there. In 2005, we said we'd do $1 billion by 2009. By 2010, we did $1 billion in 2009. And in 2010, we said we would reach $2 billion of exports by 2020. We're currently just under 1.8 billion. We won't quite get to $2 billion by 2020. It'll be 2021 or wherever. It doesn't really matter. What the industry has done has succeeded in a highly competitive international marketplace. We've set ourselves some, I wouldn't call them goals, but we've given some milestones to ourselves that we think we can achieve. And overall, we've achieved those goals over the last 20 years. So, and what's our success been based on? It's been led by one grape variety in particular, Sauvignon Blanc. and our Sauvignon Blanc represents 85% of our total exports by volume. It's a sign of great success. It's also a risk for the industry. We've also seen growth of other grape varieties and sales, but everything else really pales into comparison compared with Sauvignon Blanc. Our international reputation, our international sales, to a large extent driven by Sauvignon Blanc. We're doing very well with some other varieties and styles, but Sauvignon Blanc's our leader. So where have we come from and where are we at? We were a domestic-only industry in the 80s. We're now international. We had no reputation. Today we're seen as one of the global success stories in the wine industry. We're seen as cool climate. We're seen as a niche producer. We have a reputation. We're seen as competitive in the target markets in which we're operating. So Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc in the UK is the biggest selling single wine style in that market now. It's also probably the fastest growing wine style in the United States. It's a huge success story in Canada as well. So we've carved out a reputation. What's our point of difference? We had none back in the 80s. Our point of difference today is that the wine is from New Zealand. It's our reputation. Our reputation is our greatest asset, and it is it's the basis on which our sales are made. And that reputation has built or enabled the assets in New Zealand to be built. It's the reason that land in Marlborough changes hand at $250,000 to $300,000 per producing hectare of Sauvignon Blanc. There's hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars invested in the land, in the winery processing facilities, in the brands, and it's all based on this reputation. Where were we selling in the 80s? It was New Zealand only. 99+% of our sales were domestic. These days, United States is our biggest market, UK number 2, Australia number 3, Canada number 4, and we're doing very well. We were a North Island dominant industry in the 1980s. Today, Marlborough is somewhere in excess of 70% of all our production. We had, what's the number there? 2,500 hectares of grapes in 1981. Today we're 40,000 hectares, and we're starting to run out of land in Marlborough. By area, we're the biggest horticultural crop in the country. And as I said, we're now dominated by Sauvignon Blanc, but Pinot Noir, Pinot Gris and Chardonnay are important. 30 years ago, it was a grape variety called Müller-Thurgau, which really we couldn't sell internationally. It was not competitive. What was our aspiration back then in the 1980s? Well, it was all about the domestic market and stopping Australian wine coming in here under CER, because they were cheaper, bigger, in many ways better. Today, it's about sustainable, diversified value growth in global markets. We are very international. What's our value to New Zealand? Well, back in the early 80s, in essence, really not a lot. Today, we're 1.75, just under $1.8 billion worth of exports, with I think 6th biggest export good at the moment. If you go to the United States and you ask people what they know about New Zealand, they'll generally say 3 things. 1, they all seem to know about the All Blacks for some reason. 2nd, they know about Lord of the Rings. And 3rd, they'll talk about New Zealand wine. We're helping build a new image of New Zealand in places around the world, and that's we're pleased to be part of that. And tourism is increasingly important for us. 27% of visitors who come to New Zealand go and visit a winery when they are here. It's an astonishing number. And when it's people from the United States, it's something like 42%. And if they play golf when they're here, the number's something like 49%. So tourism is an increasingly important part of our story. What are the risks we face? Well, in the 1980s it was agricultural risk. We were worried about inflation. We were worried about competition from Australia, and we were worried about access to consumers because wine couldn't be sold in supermarkets and all those sorts of things. What are we worried about today? We worry about protecting our reputation. Given it's our most important asset, that's the thing that we worry about. We worry about the concentration, the focus we have on Marlborough and on Sauvignon Blanc. We'd like to see some more diversity. We can't argue with the success, but we acknowledge that there is some risk associated with that. We're concerned about anti-alcohol sentiment. We need to do our part to make sure that wine as a product is consumed appropriately. But there is rising anti-alcohol sentiment. We're very concerned about climate change. It's happening. Our winemakers and our growers are experiencing it. It's not something that's theoretical. From our perspective, it's something that's real. And we're increasingly concerned about the global trading environment. The scrap between the United States and China, the tensions between the United States and the EU, the difficulties going on in the WTO at the moment. 80-odd% of our current sales are in export markets. If we don't have competitive access to markets, we've got a big problem. So we are very pro-trade, and it's an increasing concern, the tensions we see out there, because that leads to a lot of uncertainty. And uncertainty, of course, is a disincentive to investment. What are the opportunities? The big issues for us, on the positive side, continuing to invest in quality, continuing to invest in our reputation, sustainability. It's a somewhat overused and at times misunderstood term, but we see that as critically important. And diversity. So growing our success outside of Marlborough, growing it outside of Sauvignon Blanc, growing it in non-traditional markets, because that adds to our story. It's not about replacing it, it's about providing different threads to the story that we're trying to tell on the market. So what have we actually done? I suppose is the point of this presentation. Well, we've worked against a background, and you need to understand the background to understand why our industry succeeded. And we have been fortunate. We're both a product of this background, and we've been able to take advantage of it. So globalisation and the opening up of markets, we would not be where we are today without the improved access that we've had. CER was both a tremendous threat to us in the 1980s, but a great opportunity. Tourism, we see that the growth in global tourism over the last 20 or 30 years, it's undeniable the impact that's had on our industry. Growth in global wealth. Wealthy people can afford to buy expensive wine. Our wine's expensive, therefore growth in global wealth obviously connect. Deregulation has been very important to us, and internationalisation of food and drink trends has been important. So that's the background. What have we actually done? We have had some visionary people in our industry. As I said, 1,500 businesses, and some of the people in the industry have been absolutely visionary. They have really provided direction for the industry to move forward. But it is the leaders who have pointed out the direction in which our industry could go. They have focused on not what is, but rather what the potential is, what could be. And if I can example, I'll give you a couple of examples. One is John Buck. John is the proprietor of Taimata Estate in Hawke's Bay. John started Taimata in the 1970s, and he did it because he believed that Hawke's Bay could produce world-class Cabernet Sauvignon wines. I'm sure some people thought he was nuts, but over 30 years that's exactly what he did. And he didn't think he could just sell those in the domestic market. He believed he could sell those wines around the world. And John pushed and cajoled and did all the things and had a plan, and he made it happen. Another gentleman was David Honan. David was a winemaker living in Western Australia and making wine in the Margaret River. And one day some New Zealand winemakers popped by and dropped in with a bottle of Sauvignon Blanc. And David was growing Sauvignon Blanc in Australia. He tasted this wine, and the thought that occurred to him is, why am I trying to grow Sauvignon Blanc in the Margaret River when those guys can do that in Marlborough? So effectively, he didn't drop everything. He came over to New Zealand, found some land, grew some grapes, and established a brand called Cloudy Bay, which is probably our most well-known winery around the world. He didn't want to sell the wine in New Zealand. The target was the global market, and he saw something that perhaps a lot of people in New Zealand hadn't seen, but he believed in something. So we've had some leaders with strong vision. We have recognised, and the industry has recognised, what our point of difference is. And there's, I won't quite say books written on it, but just about. The point of difference is, when you come down to it, that the wines are produced here in New Zealand. You can't get a Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc from anywhere other than Marlborough. You can't get a Central Otago Pinot Noir from anywhere other than Central Otago, or Hawke's Bay Syrah, or a Gisborne Gewürztraminer. It is about this place, it's about the people in this place, and it's about the attitude that those people bring to the making of wine and the growing of grapes and the selling of that product into the marketplace. That's what's different. We can be world class, but if we're not different, if we're not unique in some way, then we're world class. That's fine. But if people are going to come to New Zealand, if they're going to search out our wines, if they're going to pay above average for our product, then there needs to be something more than being world class. There needs to be a story. And that story for us is New Zealand. We've also embraced our strengths and our weaknesses. If you go to Europe, they'll all talk about the history of the wine industry in Europe. It goes back thousands of years, and it's a fantastic story, and they make brilliant wines. We don't have history. So if we don't have history and we can't use that as a selling tool, what do we have? Well, we can be new, we can be different, we can be innovative. And the classic example was, historically, wines have been sealed with a cork. And that's been the case for hundreds of years. Some New Zealand winemakers decided that corks were causing them a problem with our wine quality. And they decided to change to screw caps in early 2000s. We had a whole lot of people who said, "You're nuts." And the New Zealand winemakers said, "No, this is the right thing to do." And the thing we did that was different, or that our winemakers did, is they put screw caps on their best wines, their most expensive wines. They said, we're doing this because this is about preserving the quality of our wine. This is about preserving the reason, or the difference, that the reason you're buying our wines for, because they are different. Screw caps, about 98% of New Zealand wines today is sealed under screw caps, and it is quoted as a sign of innovation around the world. It is seen to be different. It enabled us to appeal to a different part of the market, particularly women. So we have acknowledged who we are. We know our business. There has been a huge self-belief in the industry. Without that self-belief, we would not be where we are today. Now, sometimes that self-belief may be radically misplaced. But if you talk to anybody in the industry, anybody, they will have absolute faith in what they are doing in their own business and in the place of New Zealand wine in the international marketplace. And that's from tractor drivers all the way up to CEOs. That self-belief is critical, because that's enabled us to go out into the international market and help sell our product. We've embraced two things, entirely contradictory concepts: cooperation and competition. Our businesses are fiercely competitive in the market, but they also acknowledge and understand that there is something bigger than the individual businesses. There is the New Zealand wine as a category. They understand the importance of the reputation of New Zealand wine. And so while they may be fiercely competitive in the market, they've also worked together cooperatively to help develop the market. I'll never forget, a few years ago I had a telephone call from one of our larger wineries, and they said, we're doing really well in Texas at the moment, but do you know what the biggest problem that we face is? And I said, no, I've got no idea. They said, we need more New Zealand wineries to be successful in this market, because that will help the development of the New Zealand category. We can't do it all by ourselves. We need other winemakers, other brands to be successful. I've spoken about reputation. Oh, sorry, I need to market-led. If you go to the UK and you ask some of the wine writers over there, and you said to them, how do you feel about New Zealand wine? Some of them would say, I am part of the reason that New Zealand wine has been successful in this market. There is a sense of ownership amongst key influencers that they feel part of the New Zealand wine industry. They feel part of the reason for its success. And the reason for that is our industry, if it's done nothing well in the last 20 odd years, the one thing it's done superbly well has been to go out into the market and listen to what the market has to say. Really listened to the consumers, to the retailers, to the distributors, to the importers. And it's because we have listened that we have produced wine that has sold really well. We've helped shape the market, but it's a two-way conversation, and that two-way conversation has been critical. I've talked about our reputation. We are very concerned about it. Every winemaker is very concerned about their individual brand reputation. They're concerned about the reputation of their regions, and they're concerned about the reputation of the industry. That's why we have some really quite interesting discussions in the industry. But that reputation is our biggest asset. And who's the biggest risk to that reputation? Of course, it's ourselves, because we built the reputation of the industry. And therefore, it's the industry itself which is the biggest risk to it. And what's the role of New Zealand wine growers in this? Well, if I can put it this way, our budget is, let's call it $10 million a year. The current sales value of the New Zealand wine industry is probably 2.3 billion. So we've got a very small amount of money to play with. But the industry has recognised that there are areas which require cooperation in the industry and that we are the vehicle for that cooperation. And so what we need to be is very good at what we do within that quite small box of joint industry activities. And that's what we have focused it on. We haven't strayed from our mandate, if you would like. So what's our future? What's it all about? Well, it's about growing our reputation. It's our biggest asset and we need to continue to invest in it. It is about sustainability of businesses in the broadest sense. And it's not because there are rules in place that says you need to be sustainable. It's because it's the right thing to do. It's because it's real. It's because if you don't do it, from our perspective, in 30 years' time, you won't have a business. It's about diversity, and it's about growing the value of New Zealand wine sales, both in total and on a per litre basis, so that one day maybe, going back to that original graph, we're not going to be second from the left, we'll be the country that's first on the left, so we'll be ahead of France. So that's all I wanted to say. To my starting point, 1,500 industry members, a very vibrant industry, a very competitive industry, but also one that's very cooperative and has known and knows what it's about. Thanks very much.
Now, Philip's a super busy guy, but I think there might be a time for a question before he has to be sent into a cab. Catherine.
Oh, thanks, Philip. Given your comments on globalisation, trade and tourism, I was quite surprised to see that biosecurity didn't feature on your list of risks. So in your talk, you gave a lot of emphasis on reputation as your biggest asset. Where do the physical assets come in relation to that?
Simple answer is I couldn't put everything on the slide. Yes, we see biosecurity as a major risk for us, and we've invested much more heavily in biosecurity in the last 3 years than we've ever invested before. So it's simply trying to keep things slightly readable on the slides.
Yeah, down the back.
If you go to the UK, our wine over there costs roughly the same as it does here. How does that work?
Well, New Zealand wineries sell basically at the same price wherever they sell anywhere in the world, and the ultimate retail, so our selling price out of New Zealand will be the same. The ultimate retail price is determined by the level of taxes and tariffs, distribution costs, and the margins that the retailers take. So when you add all those things up together, you know, in the UK, a bottle of Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc, as you say, is going to be the equivalent of about $15 or $16, and it is about the same price as here. So it's just the way things add up when you add all those other costs in. So it's not because the wine's being sold at any different cost here from the winery. It's just those various different costs added on top.
So you've got up there sustainability in its broader sense. What's your biggest environmental risk and how are you overcoming it?
We are very concerned about climate change and what it's going to mean, because climate change addresses and change the physical environment in which we are growing grapes, and that is obviously linked directly to our reputation. So we're doing some work with NIWA and the Australian Wine Research Institute to map what the changing climate is going to look like. I think the time frame is 2040 and also out to 2100. But there are other issues. Water, we're very concerned about waste, etc. But certainly climate change is right up there at the moment.
Okay, last question.
Philip, if I may, a comment and a question. The comment in the early 1990s, our premium venison brand, Savannah, was launched in America, in New York, at a well-known restaurant up there, and it was complemented by Palliser Estate Pinot Noir. And so the two industries have a lot to offer each other, in my view. The question, what percentage of the New Zealand industry, either by volume or by land area, is owned offshore?
It's a question I get asked frequently, and it's the very, very different ways of trying to come up with a number, but our best estimate currently would be about 1/3, about 33%. It used to be higher, but it's currently at about that level. You know, there are some very significant foreign-owned companies in New Zealand. Some of those are growing very rapidly. A number of New Zealand-owned companies are growing very rapidly as well.